Um, I suppose if I had to sum up what's going on today, right now, in the national defense, the 050 budget account, um, I would say this is no way to run a defense department. This is no way to run national defense. We have a lot of contradictions in what's going on right now. First and foremost, sequestration is law, as everyone else knows, and that does mandate, on top of the 487 or so billion that's being cut over the next 10 years, another roughly 500 billion in cuts to planned defense spending. And what complicates things is that while the president and the Congress all agree that sequestration is a terrible idea, at least in principle, and that it will be devastating over the long term to the U.S. military, in particular to its readiness, to its future procurements, and the like. There is not a genuine consensus and political will on how to solve the problem of sequestration in practice, and it's being exacerbated, for example, by the budget that President Obama belatedly released in, I believe it was spring 2013. That budget, of course, ignores sequestration without really putting a real and doable solution to replace sequester cuts on defense with some sort of alternative. And so the president has put out this message that, well, even though it's a law, he wants to ignore it, which is supposed to actually actively repeal it. And this is, in effect, punting the problem to Congress. And a question that Congress, as you all know, has had to debate is whether to accept, or at least tentatively accept, these cuts and program and plan a Defense Department and related agencies under a sequester-sized budget, or to try to move forward under a budget that is not, while not what we should have, at least is better than the status quo under law. And it remains to be seen, too, how this will all play out. But the House Armed Services Committee has put out and marked up and is now about to debate on the House floor a National Defense Authorization Act that, by my recollection, it's in total about $552 billion or thereabouts for the entire bill, what's covered under the bill under the 050 account. Obviously, things like military construction and veterans and the like are going to be under different bills. And the base budget, if I remember correctly, is $526.6 billion, with about an $85 billion overseas contingency operations funding stream for the war in Afghanistan, the war in terror. That's about $5 billion more than the president had actually requested. But part of the reason why the House has decided to do this, and I personally think it's prudent, is to make up for some of the readiness shortfalls for our war fighters in Afghanistan. And what's also problematic is that there's been a lot of pushback from the administration about plussing up this overseas contingency operations funding. More specifically, there's going to be a debate on the House floor, especially tomorrow. Look for amendments, and Caitlin will speak to this more specifically, amendments about the top line on defense spending, trying to lower it in terms of the authorized plans, the total authorized plans, the amount that they're worth. Expect amendments calling for massive reductions, if not elimination, of U.S. forces in Europe, which I personally and our organization finds imprudent, and given how much we already have cut in terms of force structure and presence in Europe, and the role that Europe in general plays in terms of rapid response throughout the Middle East and North Africa, the role it would play if there's a contingency in Iran, and as well as the logistical hub, obviously, that Europe plays, and especially in supporting other commands, and most notably Africa Command. Look for amendments, if they're ruled in order, trying to affect the debate over strategic forces. There are some measures in the NDAA that try to condition implementation of New START on what I think are personally very prudent things, such as the president certifying with high confidence what we think we know about China's strategic forces. And I think that's long overdue, because we don't live in a world with two nuclear-armed states. We live in a multipolar nuclear-armed world. And as the United States in particular continues this game of nuclear limbo, of trying to figure out how low we can go, other countries are plussing up, growing their forces. And God forbid we reach a time of nuclear parity, that would be, it's such a cliche to call it a game changer, but it really would be if we approach a world with genuine nuclear parity. In addition, look for amendments trying to cut into ballistic missile defense. There's a lot of language there in support of an East Coast site. There's been a lot of pushback today, in particular in recent days, towards an East Coast site. Vice Admiral Searing co-authored a letter, who is director of the Missile Defense Agency, co-authored a letter to Senator Levin, which pushes back against the idea of an East Coast site, at least in the near term. But we'll be releasing, hopefully later today or tomorrow, an analysis about this. Our argument is that there's a strong need for an East Coast site, given that President Obama has decided not only to cancel President Bush's plans for so-called ground-based interceptors in Poland, but President Obama also canceled his own plans for what are called the Standard Missile Block 2B interceptors that would have been placed in Poland. And instead, a lot of the burden is being placed on our current two sites for missile defense in Alaska and in Fort Greely and at Vandenberg in California. President Obama has, at least in principle, said he's going to plus up the number of interceptors in Alaska and California, add an additional 14, which in effect is replacing the 14 that Bush had planned to put there, which, again, why did we go through all this exercise only to do what had been planned before? Now, an issue here, though, is how any East Coast assets will proceed. I think, personally, there's a strong argument for an X-band radar in the East Coast, especially to provide more sensor and discrimination capabilities for our current missile defense architecture, given that we're going to be so dependent on what's on the West Coast to try to deal with any future Iranian threat. And I should add, too, in I believe it was April 2013, in the Department of Defense's report on Iran's military power, it was made very clear that Iran is progressing on its ballistic missile, its ICBM program, and with foreign assistance. The finding, the unclassified statement, is that with foreign assistance, Iran could field and test an ICBM capable of striking the United States by 2015. And so now, as to whether they do, it remains to be seen. But obviously, with Iran's history of cooperation with North Korea and other missile proliferators like North Korea, and as well as at times problematic relations with Russia and China, it's not totally beyond the pale that Iran could quickly field an ICBM capability. And so the larger point here is that we need to stay ahead of this threat. We need to compete with it. I think it's imprudent not to at least do things like put an X-band radar, which would be an asset, again, not only to our ground-based missile defense, but also to our sea-based missile defense that might be used to defend the continental United States. But I think there's also a strong prudential argument for a third site, and we'll see how that debate pans out. And last, I think Frank, you wanted me to talk about, and Caitlin will turn to the amendments on the NDAA, but Frank wanted me to mention also about what's anticipated to be President Obama's announcement of further missile defense, further strategic nuclear force cuts during a speech at Brandenburg Gate at Berlin. This announcement was supposed to be a part and parcel of the so-called nuclear NPR implementation study, and it was supposed to be announced at the State of the Union, but we had an uncooperative North Korea that during that time period had done missile and nuclear tests. And again, the president, I think, was going to announce it the next month, and again, we had an uncooperative North Korea. And one would think that the lack of cooperation by some of the states that we're trying to deter, Iran, North Korea, and others, might deter the president himself from making this announcement. But it appears that the president will, now things could change, but there's a strong chance that the president will announce that we'll go to anywhere from 1,000 to 1,100 deployed strategic nuclear warheads. We may also cut into our reserve nuclear forces. But it's not clear how this would proceed. Many on the Hill, in the Senate especially, fear that the president will try to do this with so-called informal presidential nuclear initiatives, which are, in essence, executive agreements There's mounting evidence that the Russians have violated prior presidential nuclear initiatives to reduce their nuclear forces, and expect a lot of pushback from the Hill on this idea of reductions that aren't treaty-based and that aren't sort of don't have the advice and consent of the United States.